Hello, I'm Ohio Governor Mike DeWine, and welcome to the Inclusive Employer Handbook webinar series. By being here, you demonstrate the value you place on an inclusive workplace. Thank you for that commitment. You realize that work environments inclusive of people with disabilities tap an underutilized talent pool and help us ensure that we leave no Ohioan behind. Immediately after being sworn in as governor, I established Ohio as a disability inclusion state and model employer of individuals with disabilities because I believe in equal opportunities. As we provide workplaces that offer a sense of belonging, we support improved performance and growth. These webinars will help you provide an inclusive workplace, recruit, hire, and support employees with disabilities, better understand workplace accommodations, and make work sites accessible. Best wishes for your efforts to foster an inclusive workplace. And thank you. Thank you for your effort to make Ohio a better, stronger, more inclusive place for everyone.
And thank you, Governor DeWine, for your efforts to make workplaces more inclusive. Hello, everyone. My name is Dustin Schwab, and I am a career development specialist here at Opportunities for Ohioans with Disabilities, which we refer to as OOD. Today, I am co-hosting with my colleague Julie Wood, and we'd like to welcome you to the first session in the Inclusive Employer Handbook 5-part webinar series. Julie, can you please introduce yourself and tell us more about the series?
Yes, thank you, Dustin, and welcome everyone. My name is Julie Wood. I am OOD's Worksite Accessibility Specialist. I am also an occupational therapist and a certified ADA coordinator. We are very excited to launch this webinar series, which will include a lot of great information and resources for employers. We will deliver one webinar each month, and then in partnership with our business relations specialist, we will facilitate virtual roundtable discussions throughout the year to give employers an opportunity to share ideas with each other and ask questions about best practices for inclusion in the workplace. So we are looking forward to offering that virtual networking opportunity soon. Today's webinar is titled Inclusive Workplace, and it's focused on strategies employers can use to foster a disability inclusive workplace. The next 3 webinars will cover recruiting, hiring, and supporting employees, workplace accommodations, and workplace accessibility. And then we will conclude the series with a webinar called the Accessibility Hour, which will address some of the common questions we receive about these topics. And we will also highlight the winner of the first Governor's Inclusive Employer Award.
Thank you for that introduction, Julie. I really like the idea of the virtual roundtable discussions. What a great way for employers to connect with each other and with our team to share their ideas. So with that, I'd like to mention that today's training comes with a learner's guide and a helpful fact sheet that can be accessed now through the link that is posted in the Q&A section here in Microsoft Teams. Just as a reminder, the information that we share in these resources and during today's conversation is for educational purposes only and is not legal advice, but we do hope this information is helpful for you. We'll be stopping about halfway through today's presentation and then again before we conclude to answer questions. So please post your questions in the Q&A section at any time throughout the presentation so that they're ready for us when we stop. Okay, so Julie, what will we address in today's webinar?
Dustin, we are going to discuss a variety of ways to approach creating an inclusive workplace. We know fostering this kind of environment will be unique for each employer, and we hope this information helps employers assess where they are in their inclusive workplace journey. We may share ideas that employers are already implementing, and that's fantastic. We may also share ideas that could complement the efforts employers are currently making. We will start by sharing the business case for employing individuals with disabilities and then discuss 4 main strategies for creating an inclusive workplace, which include formalizing a commitment to being a disability inclusive workplace, engaging with external resources for ideas and best practices, utilizing internal resources to support an inclusive workplace, and providing disability awareness training for employees. We certainly hope employers leave today's presentation with some action steps in mind.
Julie, you mentioned sharing ideas that employers are implementing, and throughout the presentation today and our entire Inclusive Employer Handbook series, we're going to include highlights from the applications that we received from the annual Governor's Inclusive Employer Award. So for anyone who is unfamiliar, this award was created to reinforce Governor DeWine's commitment to the inclusion of Ohioans with disabilities. OOD helped to determine the criteria for the award based on its Inclusive Employer Toolkit. And the entire Inclusive Employer Toolkit can be found on OOD's website under the Employers tab. So a committee of 5 OOD staff members scored the applications for the award based on a predetermined rubric. And the winner of the award was announced in October for National Disability Employment Awareness Month. Throughout our inclusive webinar series, we will feature topics from sections in the application for the Governor's Inclusive Employer Award. And today, I think there will be plenty of tips for employers to choose from when deciding what to implement. So, Julie, let's discuss what we mean by inclusive workplace. This is a workplace that not only recognizes the diversity of its employees, but values what the inclusion of that diversity brings to the organization. For example, a diverse group of individuals may have a range of skills and backgrounds. It can be very beneficial for an organization to draw upon these unique attributes because they can positively impact problem solving, lead to new and better ways of performing work, and improve productivity for all employees. And when employers recognize diversity and make efforts to create an inclusive and equitable culture, it can result in employees feeling more comfortable to be themselves at work. And when they do feel comfortable to share personal information like a disability, they do so in a place where they know they are respected and their unique perspective is valued.
Right, Dustin. And when an employee feels valued and included, that's when they may feel comfortable to share their unique skills and impact the workplace in the positive ways you just mentioned. An inclusive workplace can also make employees with disabilities feel confident that their employer will not tolerate any acts of bias, discrimination, or harassment in the workplace. And if these occur, they know their employer will quickly remedy the situation. Creating a disability inclusive workplace may mean you are going above and beyond your obligations under Title I of the ADA, which is the Americans with Disabilities Act. However, there are reasons this is important and beneficial to do. One big reason is because as an employer, you have employees with disabilities working for you already, whether you know it or not. And that's because 1 in 4 adults in the US live with a disability. Disabilities are not always obvious, and so you may not know an employee has a disability because the disability is invisible, like diabetes or multiple sclerosis or depressive disorder. So these statistics mean that either you are living with a disability or you have a family member, friend, or coworker who is, which makes disability a part of all our lives. And that is why making all environments, including the work environment, inclusive is so important. Each of us wants to feel we belong, we are accepted, and that the contribution we make in the world, including at work, is valued.
Absolutely. Before we share how an employer can shape their workplace to be more inclusive of people with disabilities, Julie, let's talk about how doing so can lead to several benefits like higher staff morale, larger profits, and greater productivity from staff members. We call this the business case for employing individuals with disabilities because it highlights the positive impact these inclusive efforts have on organizations. Julie, are there advantages? Can you explain what the advantages are that employers may experience?
Dustin, there was a research study which revealed employers who hire individuals with disabilities and prioritize workplace inclusion consistently outperformed their peers in terms of higher revenues, net income, and profits. This impact to the bottom line may be attributed to what has been found in other studies as well, which show employees with disabilities stay on the job longer, which reduces turnover costs, and that employing individuals with disabilities leads to the benefits you mentioned, which are increased productivity levels and morale.
There are some advantages also that might be difficult to measure. Many people with disabilities have spent their lives learning to adapt to their environments. These experiences provide a natural means to developing problem-solving skills and creativity. Obviously, these are skills that are helpful in nearly every workplace.
Dustin, that's a great point. Employees with disabilities can benefit the workplace by offering innovative ideas and a variety of perspectives for problem solving based on what you just said. People with disabilities encounter barriers in their daily lives, and because of this, may develop a persistence and a willingness to experiment that leads to finding a way to participate in the daily activities that are important to them. So becoming skilled at innovative thinking and identifying new ways to solve problems can be an attribute of an employee with a disability, and certainly that can be beneficial at work. As an occupational therapist, I often worked with individuals in the workplace to assess what was needed to remove a workplace barrier and enable the individual to either access the environment or perform the job. And often the best and most effective ideas that were identified came from the individual because they could problem solve how to make the workplace or activity accessible. Skills like that are often transferable to other work-related problems. And so you're strengthening your workplace when you not only employ individuals with disabilities, but you go beyond that to cultivate a culture of inclusion that values the skills your employees have to offer.
Julie, that's so true. And some of the benefits of problem solving and creativity that individuals with disabilities bring to the workplace help employers to reach new customers.
Right, so this is a webinar focused on employing individuals with disabilities. However, all employers have customers. And so let's talk about how employing individuals with disabilities can also have a positive impact on your customer base. According to the Employer Assistance and Resource Network, or EARN, individuals with disabilities make up the third largest market segment in our country. Now, if you are a person without a disability, you may not be aware of the needs individuals with disabilities have in relation to accessing your products and services. But individuals with disabilities are aware. So it's possible that when you employ individuals with disabilities and cultivate an inclusive workplace, you may benefit from innovative thinking and creative problem-solving skills, which can transfer into ensuring your products and services are accessible for your customers with disabilities. And we have learned that when we make things accessible, it often benefits everyone. So think of services we all enjoy, like automatic doors when we enter grocery stores and voice recognition to send text messages. When you create products and services with accessibility in mind, it may help you attract this valuable market segment.
Plus, people with disabilities have friends and family who want to support businesses who are inclusive and take steps to make their products and services accessible. So employers may gain them as customers as well. Okay, Julie, back to the workplace. So now I'm an employer that has bought into the countless benefits of an inclusive workplace for individuals with disabilities. I want the improved staff morale, the increased productivity and innovation, a better financial position, and a loyal customer base. So where can I start?
Dustin, employers who successfully build inclusive workplaces are intentional about doing so, which means they have formalized their commitment to both hiring and supporting individuals with disabilities and ensuring the workplace supports a culture of disability inclusion.
So a place for employers to start then is with a formalized commitment, which is fairly broad. This can be anything from written policies to a strategic plan to the images that employers use in their marketing materials.
Dustin, employers can also formalize their commitment through formal statements, which are communicated from top-level executives, posting equal employment opportunity and reasonable accommodation statements in key locations, including disability and diversity-related activities, incorporating disability-related topics in employee newsletters, and sharing the business case for employing individuals with disabilities with stakeholders.
Julie, I've seen many websites that state very literally a commitment to diversity and inclusion. The statement might say something like, our organization is committed to hiring a diverse and inclusive workforce, and then explain how it will do so. So including this statement on a web page allows an employer to communicate this commitment beyond its current employees. Prospective employees and even customers can also recognize the employer's commitment to inclusion.
Correct, Dustin. And when this statement comes from top-level executives and includes disability, it can send a message to applicants, employees, and customers that this is an employer who values diversity and recognizes that disability is a part of diversity. This statement often becomes the employer's vision for disability inclusion in their workplace, and it helps to inform the objectives and policies that help employers to take action and implement their vision. Top level buy-in does something else I think is very important, and that is it encourages managers and supervisors to facilitate inclusive practices into their daily operations, which helps to further permeate inclusion in the organization's culture.
And we included examples of how some employers are expressing their formal commitment in the learner's guide. Julie, you mentioned that a formal commitment can lead to policies which help the organization carry out their vision for inclusion. Some of the employers that submitted applications for the Governor's Inclusive Employer Award shared the specific policies that they use to ensure people with disabilities are included in their workplaces.
That's right, Dustin. One of the employers reported having a diversity and inclusion policy that is available to its employees through the internet and is incorporated into new hire training. The policy specifically recognizes disability by discussing the ADA and reasonable accommodations. Another employer reported having a non-discrimination policy that includes disability, and to support this, they have a diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI, department and a steering committee. These kind of policies help employers express to their employees why committing to a disability inclusive workplace is important to the organization.
And Julie, it sounds like these policies provide guidance to the employees of the organization as to how to be inclusive of people with disabilities.
They can, Dustin. A policy often complements the formal commitment an employer makes by describing how an organization plans to achieve becoming a disability inclusive workplace. What's key about these policies is they need to recognize disability as a form of diversity. Some policies encourage DEI-related activities to be provided in the workplace. So to be fully inclusive, some of these events should include topics related to disability. For example, the Disability In website described how TD Bank celebrated National Disability Employment Awareness Month. What they did is host weekly online coffee chats that were focused on accessibility and disability inclusion in the workplace. They also created blogs and posted videos where employees with disabilities voluntarily shared their personal stories. And one final topic that diversity policy should include is how the employer will quickly address any acts of bias, discrimination, or harassment that occurs at work related to disability, so it's clear to all employees that these acts are prohibited.
Very important points. Thank you, Julie. So now, equal employment opportunity, or EEO statements, are similar to policy statements and commitments of inclusion. These statements indicate that the employer does not discriminate based on protected statuses, one of which is a disability. What might be important for employers to remember when sharing equal opportunity statements?
Dustin, an EEO statement is a statement of inclusion, and it's best to post this in the same key locations in the workplace and on websites where you post other important notices for applicants and employees and make it easy to find. It's important to post this statement in a way that is accessible for individuals with disabilities. For example, when this statement is posted on site, make sure the location is physically accessible for an individual with a mobility limitation. Or when this statement is posted online, make sure it's accessible for a person who is blind and uses a screen reader. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, which is known as the EEOC, requires employers to post EEO statements. So we included a resource in the learner's guide from the EEOC, which provides information about this requirement and their free poster called EEO is the Law. We also included 2 additional resources. One is from the Society of Human Resource Management, known as SHRM, which provides information on what to include in an EEO policy. And then from both SHRM and the Job Accommodation Network, known as JAN, we provided examples of EEO statements.
Another statement an inclusive employer can include on job postings, invitations to interview, meeting invitations, and other professional communications is a reasonable accommodation statement. Julie, how are these different from EEO statements?
Dustin, unlike the EEO statement, employers are not required to post a reasonable accommodation statement, but it is a best practice. Employers who are committed to inclusion in the workplace want to know if applicants or employees experience a barrier in the hiring process or at work. This statement invites individuals with disabilities to report these barriers and informs them of how to make a request for a reasonable accommodation if one is needed. Just like EEO statements, these should be included in key areas like the ones you mentioned. They should be easy to find and be posted in accessible ways. Some employers combine their reasonable accommodation statement with their EEO statement, which can communicate that you are an inclusive employer who cares about what individuals with disabilities need to access the hiring process, perform the job, and enjoy the benefits of employment.
And we've included an example from Jan of a combined EEO and reasonable accommodation statement in the learner's guide. Now, Julie, you've told me the reasonable accommodation statement is your favorite accessibility topic. Can you explain why?
It is, Dustin, and here's why. When you truly care about what applicants and employees with disabilities need, you want to know when they experience a barrier related to work. As much as we all have good intentions to make the workplace accessible, we have to recognize that we're just not there yet. And so a reasonable accommodation statement is our path to access along the way. It's like a bridge that takes us away from a barrier and connects us with another way to access the work-related activity through the use of a reasonable accommodation. And that's why I think it's so important, because we need to have access along the way to achieving the goal of accessibility for everyone.
I like that bridge metaphor. So we will talk about the best practices inclusive employers rely on to provide reasonable accommodations in the third webinar in this series. Now, another way employers can reinforce their commitment to the inclusion of employees with disabilities is through their marketing materials. For example, newsletters that are provided for employees or stakeholders could include topics related to disability inclusion in the workplace. Julie, what are some topics that an employer might include?
Dustin, there's a variety of topics employers could include, but I do have two examples from PEAT, which is the Partnership on Employment and Accessible Technology, that I'd like to share. The first is from Oracle Corporation. Oracle publishes a staff newsletter called Dimensions of Diversity, and it has featured articles on making PDF documents accessible and articles on making multimedia accessible. Both are great topics, especially with so much of our work being done in the digital environment. The other example is from Ernst & Young, and what they offer for employees is a series of 60-second videos called Access Abilities Minutes, and these share tips on fostering an inclusive workplace and have also highlighted accessible technology.
Julia, 60-second video is a creative way to quickly keep reinforcing the importance of inclusion and accessibility. That's such a great idea. Now, beyond the topics included in marketing materials, employers could utilize pictures that show people with disabilities participating in work-related activities.
Yes, Dustin, this is a great way to demonstrate equality in the workplace. If you aren't sure where to start, Disability In offers disability inclusive stock photography, which is available to the public. They just request you cite them as a reference when you use their images, and they provide the instructions on how to do so on their website. We included an example here in the PowerPoint of a woman seated in a small conference room using sign language during a virtual conversation she is having through her laptop.
And we also included images in the learner's guide along with this resource from Disability In. Julie, another thing that you mentioned employers can do to create an inclusive culture is to share the business case for a workplace that is inclusive of people with disabilities. That reminds me of when I was a supervisor of employment services for people with disabilities, and we worked with an organization that was very committed to training and hiring the individuals that we serve, and they loved to share their experience with other employers. They even helped us set up a similar relationship with another organization, and in turn, this led to more opportunities for the individuals with disabilities that we served.
Dustin, sharing positive experiences is compelling. And when employers do this internally by informing their leadership, supervisors, and stakeholders of the benefits of employing individuals with disabilities, it can further facilitate creating a disability inclusive workplace.
Thank you, Julie. I think this is a good time to stop and see what questions have come in. Just so everybody knows, we fielded some questions ahead of time with our registration for this training that we are including in this section as well. So Julie, one of those questions that we got ahead of time was, what suggestions do you have on how to market your business as a disability-friendly employer, and what are some practical techniques to attract applicants with disabilities?
So there's a lot of ways that you can do those attractions to the public about you being a disability-friendly employer, and we talk about a lot of those in the training today, but that's the formal statement of commitment that we talked about, where you're posting on your website that you are a disability-inclusive employer, making sure to have those statements we talked about available in key locations, like the reasonable accommodation statement, the equal employment opportunity statement. We just talked about including images of people with disability. You can put those in your marketing materials and on your website. Another great way that we'll talk about in a little bit to kind of market yourself this way is to benchmark your efforts against other employees. And one way to do that is through the Disability Equality Index. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that in the training.
Great, thank you. Another question that we got ahead of time was, what services does OOD provide for the Latin community?
So OOD is making some efforts to better serve the Latino community. We're doing that in a variety of ways, such as collaborating with the Ohio Latino Commission, attending Latino networking meetings, and identifying vocational rehabilitation counselors who speak Spanish, who can then be assigned a designated caseload to serve the Latino community. These efforts are beginning in the East Central and Northeast regions of the state.
Cool. And what is the most challenging aspect to creating a disability inclusive workplace?
I think this was my favorite question that we received, even if we're not supposed to have favorites, because I think we all sometimes think something is more challenging than it is. So the quick answer to that is, what's going to be challenging for you is unique to your organization. However, we share a lot of best practices in today's webinar and throughout this series. And I think you'll find as you hear some of these, you're probably doing some of these already. And I think you'll find some things that might fall into place with those efforts you're already making. And so I would just challenge you to take one step after today's training where you identify one thing that you can move forward with. Because really anything that we feel is challenging, the best way to tackle it is just one step at a time. So just take that next step. When that's complete, take the next one.
Awesome. And then one more question that we got. What are the 5 best ways for an organization to promote inclusivity during the hiring process?
That's a great question. One great way is to attend our next webinar in the session. Or in the series in February, which is recruiting, hiring, and supporting employees. But instead of making you wait till February, I'll share some ideas now. So to promote inclusion in your hiring process, certainly include that reasonable accommodation statement on your hiring page online, in your applications. Make sure when you post for open jobs that the job posting itself is accessible, as well as your applications, whether they're online or in person. Just make sure they're accessible. Training your hiring professionals on your responsibilities under Title I of the ADA and on disability etiquette and awareness can be very helpful. And then just being familiar with some of the common reasonable accommodations that might be needed to make the interview, the onboarding process, the application accessible can certainly be very helpful.
Thank you, Julie. And thank you if you submitted any of those questions or any other questions. Thank you for sending those ahead of time. We have some more that we'll answer at the end of the presentation, but if you have any questions in the meantime, feel free to put them in the Q&A box because we'll be taking another break before we finish. So, Julie, so far we have shared several ways that employers can express a formal commitment to employing individuals with disabilities and fostering disability inclusive workplaces. So I think this is a great and important first step, but a formal commitment is best supported with action. And there are many ways for employers to take steps to reach their goals. So let's talk first about how employers can do this through participation with external organizations.
Dustin, there are three main ways employers can utilize external organizations to support their goals for being inclusive. First, employers can learn from what other employers are doing to foster disability inclusion. Employers can also participate in disability-focused organizations and activities, which may provide an awareness employers can use to inform their workplace efforts. And employers can partner with external organizations like OOD for disability-related education and sourcing of qualified candidates with disabilities.
Julie, you mentioned learning from other employers, and one way that you actually just mentioned in your question and answer was that employers can do this by benchmarking their efforts against those of their peers.
That's correct, Dustin. Benchmarking is a tool employers can use to compare their efforts with those of employers who are successfully incorporating disability inclusion into their workplace culture. When you know what is working well for another organization, you can identify how to integrate their best practices into your workplace. And so benchmarking serves as one way employers can continually improve their efforts.
How would an employer go about this, Julie?
Employers can do this by being a member of a professional organization that is focused on disability or by participating in their events. These organizations often offer education focused on disability in the workplace and provide employers an opportunity to network with their peers who are making similar efforts. For example, Disability In is a worldwide resource on disability inclusion, and they offer many ways for employers to identify best practices. For example, they offer online resources which address disability-related topics. They host an annual conference which combines a variety of educational sessions along with opportunities to learn from and network with other employers. Their website also includes information about the Disability Equality Index, which is an assessment-based benchmarking tool, and we'll talk about that shortly. Other organizations that offer networking opportunities and educational events include the Ohio Diversity Council, the Ohio Industry Liaison Group, and the Ohio Society for Human Resource Management.
These are great resources, and we've included their information in the Learner's Guide. Julie, let's talk about benchmarking assessments. You mentioned the Disability Equality Index, which several of the employers who applied for the Governor's Inclusive Employer Award cited using. And one employer mentioned using the employment tracker from the National Organization on Disability. How are these beneficial for employers?
Dustin, these assessments are beneficial because they address several aspects of an organization and they provide comprehensive results that help employers know what they're doing well and where to prioritize their efforts and take action. For example, some of the areas included in the Disability Equality Index are culture and leadership, employment practices, and supplier diversity. Some of the areas included in the employment tracker are strategy, talent outcome metrics, and workplace tools and accessibility. These assessments also offer recognition for employers who achieve a certain level of disability inclusion, which some employers use as a recruitment tool to attract qualified candidates and to retain a qualified workforce.
Good point. Employers might set up schedules for benchmarking their efforts. The National Organization on Disability discusses how employers can benefit from an annual review of their disability inclusion practices. However, there are also ways employers can engage with external organizations on a more frequent basis, like participating in community events and activities that are focused on disability.
That's right, Dustin. Now, these efforts may not have a direct tie to employment. However, the employer's involvement can serve to increase their awareness, which can still have a positive impact in the workplace with fostering a disability inclusive culture. There are many ways for employers to get involved. For example, an employer may participate in their local Special Olympics events or join their community's Autism Speaks walk or attend a conference related to disability. Employers may also volunteer to serve on a board or a committee that is focused on disability, like their local community center for the deaf or a site center. I found an interesting example through the Disability In website about Bank of America's Cause Champions. These champions participate in a disability-related organization, and then they bring information back to the workplace in the form of hosting training sessions, leading volunteer efforts, and inviting subject matter experts to talk on disability-related topics at work.
I like that you mentioned serving on the board of a nonprofit organization, because several of the employers that applied for the Governor's Inclusive Employer Award indicated that they have employees who are on the boards of organizations that serve individuals with disabilities. Employers might also consider volunteering for an organization that serves individuals with disabilities during work hours. So Julie, I used to work at a camp for individuals with disabilities down in Florida, and we would often have employers contact us about service days for their employees. Many were interested in hosting camp sessions for the guests that attended our sessions. And these activities that they hosted were even more successful when they incorporated the skills of the employees into the efforts. But another external organization that can help support employers' inclusion efforts is Opportunities for Ohioans with Disabilities. And we have business relations specialists that partner with employers throughout the state. And we have our very own Ron Klinowski to explain the benefits of an employer partnership with OOD.
Opportunities for Ohioans with Disabilities, OOD, is the state of Ohio agency that empowers Ohioans with disabilities through employment, disability determinations, and independence. To accomplish this mission, OOD serves two customers. One, the individuals with disabilities seeking employment, and two, employers who are looking for qualified candidates while diversifying their workforce. That's where the business relations specialists come in. We develop strategic partnerships with employers to help address their hiring needs. Typically, when we first meet with an employer, we discuss their business in general and then delve into their frequently posted positions, learning everything from the responsibilities of the jobs to background and education level requirements. The more information we gather from that discussion, the better it enables us to identify the right job candidates from OOD's participants. Serving as a workforce development resource, we not only provide you with qualified candidates for your openings, we offer an opportunity to continue to create a diverse and inclusive environment at your business. Adults with disabilities make up 25% of the working population, meaning if you are partnering with Opportunities for Ohioans with Disabilities, you are greatly expanding your pool of candidates. And once hired, employees with disabilities add tremendously to your workplace culture. Studies show that morale increases when you have employees with disabilities as part of your team. Your company is also gaining a unique perspective from someone who can provide insight into how to better serve customers that have that same disability. Aside from sourcing individual job applicants for your openings, OOD's business relations team provides other valuable services. Throughout the year, our agency holds virtual hiring events. During these events, OOD arranges virtual interviews with qualified candidates who have been pre-screened according to your requirements. Contact the business relations specialist in your region for more information on how you can be a part of a virtual hiring event. Business relations specialists can also provide your company with disability etiquette and awareness training free of charge. There are many different trainings we offer. Some are geared toward upper management, others to human resource staff, and many would be appropriate for all staff members. For example, our disability etiquette training discusses respectful interactions between employees with and without disabilities. It delves into appropriate ways to communicate and things that should be avoided. Reach out to your business relations specialist to have a discussion to determine which trainings will be appropriate to achieve your goals. In general, for any disability-related issues that arise, always feel free to reach out to your BRS. They will help you or make sure you are connected with the right person.
Thank you, Ron. Okay, Julie, now that employers have worked with external organizations to support their inclusion of individuals with disabilities in the workplace, what can employers do internally to support an inclusive work culture?
Dustin, according to the Small Business at Work Toolkit, which is from the Northeast ADA Center, individuals want to work for employers who care about the needs of employees with and without disabilities. We know it requires planning and ongoing effort to foster an environment where all employees feel comfortable to be themselves, to offer their unique contribution, and to ask for what they need. So we have examples of internal strategies employers can use to do this, which include dedicating the responsibility of managing your disability inclusion efforts to a person or a team, creating an employee resource group that is focused on disability, and forming a diversity committee.
Julie, you mentioned dedicating an internal source who is responsible for supporting the needs of employees with disabilities. This helps employers ensure disability is contained within the efforts to be inclusive. Do you have an example of how employers can go about this?
Yes, Dustin, one thing employers can do is assign the responsibility of facilitating the reasonable accommodation process. We discussed earlier why it's important to have a reasonable accommodation statement. For that statement to be helpful in removing a barrier in the workplace, the request for a reasonable accommodation needs to be received by someone who recognizes the request and knows to begin the reasonable accommodation process right away. Now, in smaller organizations, this might be the responsibility of one person, and in a larger organization, this might be the responsibility assigned to an entire team within human resources. If you are curious about the responsibilities of this role, we shared a resource for sample job descriptions from Jan in the Learner's Guide.
Julie, at OOD, you've been assisting with the reasonable accommodation process. So you have time set aside to assist staff members with disabilities with accommodations. Do you want to explain a little about what this role entails?
Sure. Some of my responsibilities include identifying requests for accommodations, knowing when to ask for documentation, and then facilitating a collaborative conversation with the individual making the request, and then knowing when to include others in the process, like supervisors or IT professionals. And then, of course, it's my responsibility to keep the process moving and monitor any accommodations that are implemented to make sure they're effective. Title I says employers should respond to requests for reasonable accommodations and begin the interactive process promptly. So assigning these responsibilities helps to ensure this happens, and it can demonstrate that you care about what employees with disabilities need in the workplace.
That is very true. Now, several employers mentioned their employee resource groups, or ERGs, when applying for the Governor's Inclusive Employer Award. These are groups of employees that work together to address the needs of a specific group within the organization. Some of the types of ERGs mentioned by our applicants for the Governor's Inclusive Employer Award were related to people with disabilities, LGBTQ employees, women, racial minorities, veterans, and young professionals. The structure of these groups might vary from organization to organization. Customarily, they offer networking opportunities for employees with shared interests. They also provide an outlet to address the needs and concerns of the group, giving members an opportunity to affect change at that organization.
Yes, Dustin, ERGs can make a big difference, and there are some key practices to help make them successful. The first is to make sure the group includes representation from all levels of the organization, so it can capture all the work-related needs of the group. The next key practice is to develop a clear mission and established goals, because these help to make sure the needs of the group are met. And it's vital to have commitment to the group from leadership, because leaders are the ones who can make decisions so the group can take action and move forward with creating positive change in the organization.
These groups are a great way to give time for people to share their experiences in the workplace with people who might have similar experiences. Not only that, but they can also help the employer improve its processes. An ERG focused on topics related to disability might reveal some accessibility barriers at the organization and help the employer identify ways to become more accessible for employees, applicants, and customers. Julie, can you share some outcomes of ERGs with us?
Absolutely. I have two examples from Disability In's website. The first is about Northwestern Mutual's Disability Alliance Employee Resource Group. This group facilitated a discussion about reasonable accommodations related to a barrier a deaf employee was experiencing at work. The group offered suggestions to make the work environment more accessible, which resulted in the organization providing closed captioning at their town hall meetings and also in their videos and podcasts. And as a result, the employee reported how elated she was to fully participate in these communications at work. The other example is from Dell's ERG called True Ability. This group partnered with Dell's talent acquisition team to make the hiring process accessible for candidates with autism, and they provided education on disability etiquette for their recruiters and hiring managers. We also offer this kind of training for our employer partners, and we will share information about that shortly.
These examples demonstrate fantastic outcomes from the efforts of ERGs. For more information, we've included two resources in the Learner's Guide. The first is an ERG toolkit from Disability In, which addresses disability inclusion throughout the entire employment cycle and includes several tools and resources. And then the other is from Earn, which includes a toolkit on how to approach creating a disability-focused ERG, how to implement an ERG, and a fact sheet for planning accessible events. Julie, one of the employers who applied for the Governor's Inclusive Employer Award had a diversity committee. How is this different from an ERG?
Dustin, an ERG is customarily a group of individuals engaged in a shared purpose that is specific, like a focus on disability, whereas a diversity committee is customarily more general because it covers all aspects of diversity. To be fully inclusive, it's important to acknowledge disability as a form of diversity and include terms like disability and people with disabilities in descriptions of the group's purpose and activities. A diversity committee is the group of employees who are charged with carrying out the goals in the organization's DEI policy and promoting diversity in the workplace. Just like with an ERG, it's important to include executives, leaders, and all levels of employees in the committee to have full representation of the needs in the workplace and to have support for making decisions and taking action. The best practices for this group's success include having a mission, a budget, and a way to measure performance so you know if the efforts being made are benefiting employees and the organization. Diversity committees often achieve their goals through activities like providing education, hosting events, contributing to policies that impact diversity, and engaging with employees on DEI-related topics. One of the employers who applied for the Governor's Inclusive Employer Award indicated their diversity committee uses a three-tiered approach to achieve their goals. One approach is to create a safe work environment. Another is to provide education and awareness. And the last is to partner with internal business units to facilitate inclusive practices in the workplace.
Thank you, Julie. Okay, the last topic on which we want to focus today is disability awareness training. Now, OOD offers disability awareness and etiquette training to employers at no cost. This training is designed to help employees feel comfortable when they are interacting respectfully with their colleagues, applicants, or customers with disabilities. If employers are interested in learning more about how OOD can help provide this training, please reach out to the business relations specialist assigned to your area of the state. We have included a map of each of their service areas in the Learner's Guide. Julie, let's start by discussing disability awareness training.
Sure. So OOD has an awesome team of 5 business relations specialists who deliver a variety of interactive presentations on-site or virtually, which can be customized for an employer's specific goals. These presentations can support employers in their efforts to create workplaces that are diverse and inclusive of individuals with disabilities. For example, our disability awareness training helps employers to examine any personal biases and attitudes they may have about people with disabilities. We have a training on invisible disabilities, which addresses the fears and myths and barriers that can be associated with disabilities that aren't apparent, like a traumatic brain injury, an anxiety disorder, or an intellectual disability. And we have a creative and informative training about the hiring process and onboarding, which talks about the barriers that can be present and shares ways to make it more accessible for people with disabilities.
There really are a lot of great options for employers. And our disability etiquette training offers examples of respectful interactions with people with disabilities, and it reviews proper language usage. This training can also be customized for your organization, and it can be presented virtually or in person. We even have an on-demand version on our website. Julie, can you give us a sample of what's addressed in this training?
Sure, Dustin. Sometimes when we aren't sure what to do, we either do nothing or we do something that we think is helpful, but it might not be. And although we have good intentions, we aren't aware of how our actions may be received by another person. So what this training does so well is help all of us build awareness of how to respectfully interact with people with disabilities. The training addresses physical, mental, visual, hearing, intellectual, and developmental disabilities and provides examples of proper interactions. And so I have a couple of examples from the training that I'll share with you now. The first is when you are interacting with a person with a hearing disability, if you don't understand what they are communicating, don't pretend to. Ask the person to repeat what they said or to write it down. Another example is when you are interacting with a person who uses a service animal, it's important to remember the animal is working and not to distract the animal. So you should not pet the animal or call it by name or offer it a treat. The training includes many more examples and also addresses language. Sometimes a word choice from the past evolves over time to take on a negative connotation. And so this training makes suggestions for better word choices or ways to say things. For example, rather than saying handicapped parking, it's better to say accessible parking. The training also addresses the difference between people first language and identity first language.
Julie, one of the things I learned when I first took this training was about the increase in preference of identity first language. This is language that emphasizes a person's disability when speaking about that person, like saying an autistic employee instead of saying an employee who has autism. As someone who has worked and lived with individuals with disabilities for most of my life, I was accustomed to using person first language, which refers to the person before the disability, like saying an employee who is blind. This training helped me better recognize the preferences of some people with disabilities to be identified by their disabilities first. Therefore, I think the training is a great resource for teams with any level of experience working and interacting with people with disabilities. Julie, do you want to share something that you learned or a favorite part of disability awareness training?
Yes, my favorite part of the training is how it addresses the way we help others. Sometimes when we perceive someone to need help, we jump in to automatically do something for someone. But what's appropriate is to offer help. It's best to ask the person if you can assist instead of assuming they need help. This demonstrates respect for the person. The person will know whether they need help. So I was glad to see this addressed in the training.
Oh yeah, I like that part too. So let's take one more break to see what questions have come in. We do have a couple of questions, Julie. The first one, sorry. What about a group that gives individuals with disabilities the opportunity to speak about barriers that they've struggled with regarding obtaining a job or job skills, learning how to get a job? Maybe there is maybe there's already one of these, but hearing from individuals may give even more insight into how we can help.
Yeah, and that's absolutely true. People with disabilities are the best people to talk with about the barriers that they're encountering and the ways to make something more accessible. What you're describing sounds like the employee resource group. However, you're mentioning folks who are encountering barriers on the way to getting a job, it sounds like. And so it'd be unique to find the environment where you could bring individuals together to talk about that if the focus really is on the hiring process. I mean, that could be addressed through an ERG as well. So yeah, I think that's a fantastic idea. We included some resources that Dustin referenced in the learner's guide on how to create this kind of group in the workplace and some of the best practices for making it successful. So yeah, great idea.
Great. And how can an employer support an employee with accommodations when the employee is not asking for specific accommodations, but is rather asking the employer to offer examples of what the employer can offer?
Well, some ways you can support your employees with disabilities is by having that reasonable accommodation process, making sure employees are aware of that. So, addressing that in onboarding training, having that maybe as part of an annual review of policies, just so employees remember that that this right to reasonable accommodation is out there. If an employee is talking to you about what the employer can offer, if they've mentioned anything about a barrier in the workplace or a disability or a medical condition, you can explore that a little bit more to see if what they really are asking for is a reasonable accommodation, just to clarify. And then if they are, you should begin the interactive process to see, what specific solution can be provided. Beyond that, I mean, an employee resource group could be helpful also to kind of collect these ideas of barriers in the workplace and then start brainstorming how to make it more accessible.
It's nice that you brought the employee resource group back up because that's related to our next question. How would you recommend reaching out to the employee base to recruit new members for a DEI committee?
Well, you could do that through your ERG. You could do that through your employee newsletter, through your anything that you post on the website, that like an intranet that might attract employees to know what's new in the workplace, how they can participate in the workplace. Sharing stories can be helpful. So if you already have some members on the committee, maybe they can talk with their peers and coworkers or speak to other divisions about, what the group would be and what you'd be participating in and what the goals would be. So a variety of ways to maybe promote that.
Cool. Thank you, Julie. We have some more questions that were pre-submitted that we're going to finish answering at the end of our presentation, but to be mindful of people's time, we're going to finish the presentation and then we'll stick around and answer those questions at the end of the presentation. So thank you all for those great questions. Now, Julie, I think we've gone over a lot of suggestions for creating an inclusive workplace culture, but before we finish, do you want to recap some of the main points?
Sure, Dustin. In this first webinar in the Inclusive Employer Handbook, our goal was to create a foundation for an inclusive workplace and share the many ways this can be fostered, like through formalizing your commitment to being a disability inclusive workplace, engaging with external organizations, utilizing internal resources to support inclusion, and including disability awareness training for your employees. I hope you have found at least one idea from today's training that you wish to move forward with to continue your efforts in creating a workplace that is inclusive of people with disabilities. OOD is here to help. If you have a question or a project related to disability inclusion or accessibility in the workplace, please contact your local business relations specialist or me, and we are happy to partner with you in your efforts. I appreciate you attending today. And Dustin, it's always a pleasure to present with you.
Thank you, Julie. And thank you all for joining us. But also thank you to Governor DeWine and Business Relations Specialist Ron Klinowski for their submissions today. As a reminder, please remember to submit the training evaluation to receive HRCI or SHRM credit. If you do not need these credits, then we still invite you to complete the evaluation because this will help us to continually improve the information that we provide to employers through these webinars. We will be posting a recording of today's presentation and we will forward that link to you at a later time. And also I'd like to announce that our next webinar will be February 16th, 2022 with our second webinar in the Inclusive Employer Handbook entitled Recruiting, Hiring, and Supporting Employees. So please be on the lookout for that announcement. We'd love to have you join us again. Thank you and see you in February. So if anybody wants to stick around, we are going to finish answering some of these questions that we had come in. Julie, the first one that was pre-submitted was, is there funding and guidance for organizations to upgrade older buildings, making them wheelchair accessible?
There is a lot of guidance and one resource for funding. So let me share some of that information. First of all, the fourth session in this Inclusive Employer Handbook series is going to talk about workplace accessibility. That will be April 21st. You also, employer partners, are able to reach out to me for a worksite accessibility consult, and we can talk about the accessibility of your physical built environment in a little more detail. There are standards for accessible design that are published from the Department of Justice that speak to Titles II and Title III, but they're a great resource for employers to take a look at. So we could provide that resource to you if you want to contact me. They're called the 2010 Standards for Accessible Design. And then the U.S. Access Board has taken those standards and created a lot of great videos and illustrations to help kind of bring those technical guidelines to life in the work environment, so you can kind of see what the technical information is really referring to. As far as funding, there is a barrier removal tax deduction, which is offered by the IRS. And so if you're eligible for that, the tax deduction can be up to $15,000. And it's for employers who are removing architectural or transportation barriers.
Great, thank you. Another question that came in at the end of our presentation is, what do you do when a disability is a mental health related disability?
So a mental health disability can be invisible. So that's one where we were talking earlier about how it may not be apparent that a person has a disability. But if a person is mentioning a barrier in the workplace and they've related it to a medical condition or a disability, you would treat that as a request for a reasonable accommodation and go through the interactive process to identify what the barrier is and collaborate with the employee on what might be an effective accommodation in the workplace. In our on-demand library of webinars, the first one we did was on mental health in the workplace. And so that can be a great resource for understanding what some common accommodations might be related to a mental health disability, and also what might be unique about navigating the interactive process when a disability is not apparent. And so you approach it as you would any request for an accommodation.
Great. So when a candidate is applying for a job, when is the best time to disclose their disability and how should it be expressed?
So the best time to disclose a disability and request an accommodation is when the individual chooses to, because an individual never has to disclose a disability if they don't want to. Now, to receive protection under Title I and receive an accommodation, part of that process does require the person to disclose a disability to receive that protection, but it's the individual's choice when to do that. If I was being asked this question by an individual with a disability, what I would say is the best time to disclose this and ask for an accommodation is when you perceive or anticipate a barrier in the hiring or the work-related process, or when you encounter a barrier. That way the barrier can be addressed and accommodation can be provided right away. And certainly if you notice a barrier that impacts your performance at work, it's a good idea to consider disclosing and asking for an accommodation before it impacts your performance.
All right, and where is the best place to access training for things like JAWS?
So JAWS is screen reading software that individuals who are blind or have low vision may use when they are accessing the digital environment to read forms and documents, emails. And so training on how to use JAWS is provided in a variety of ways, but one of the best sources to start with is through Freedom Scientific, their website, because they're the maker of JAWS. And so they have a lot of resources for training, some FAQs that are no charge. I would start there, and we could certainly provide you with that information if that's helpful.
Great, thank you. And the last question that we're planning to answer today, what resources can managers find on OOD's website to help them with inclusion for their employees with disabilities?
So we have a lot of great resources for employers. If you go to our website, which is www.ood.ohio.gov, we have a page called Information for Employers. And so if you go there, we've organized all of our resources for you to find easily. We have an inclusive employer toolkit, and this has information and resources that help employers to recruit, hire, and retain individuals with disabilities. We have best practices for inclusive workplaces included in the toolkit, and we have a link to the business relations specialist in that toolkit. So you can certainly, for more information, reach out to the BRS that serves your area. On the welcome page on the website in the employer section, we do list all the upcoming and the archived webinars that we've provided, if that's helpful. And then we have an employer resources section that lists all of our resources in alphabetical order, so they're easy to find that way.
Great. Thank you, Julie. And thank you all for those great questions, whether they were during the presentation or prior to the presentation. We will see you in February.